Alrighty, hello, welcome back to the Three-Handed Bandits channel. Today it's Nathan back with another breakdown of our 2023-2024 power rankings. Today we're unveiling the 26th ranked New Orleans Saints. This is a team that has a lot of expectations. Obviously, they brought in Derek Carr, a little bit of a new quarterback at the helm, and this is a team that has expectations to compete and probably win the NFC South. However, this is a team that I am lower on for a multitude of reasons, and we'll kind of get into that in just a second. This video was inspired by that franchises guys deep dive, so please go and check these out. We do have our own opinions over here, and today, obviously, we're talking about the Saints. So as I alluded to, this is a team I'm lower on. It's a team that I think has some issues and some holes. And we'll kind of start by, kind of talking about their offseason, kind of what they brought in and what they lost. So obviously the biggest addition is they bring in Derek Carr from the Raiders. Derek Carr has been one of these guys who's been in the, kind of mid-ish tier of starting quarterbacks, like the Kirk Cousins, the Dak Prescotts of talented quarterbacks who still need, everything to be really good around them for them to win. And, we saw with Derek Carr towards the end of the John Gruden tenure there, he had a really good season that year. Obviously, John Gruden got fired, and there was the Henry Ruggs car accident, and there was just this, huge chaotic stuff going on in the back, and I think he was a really good leader for that team. However, last year he really struggled, and so they're bringing in Derek Carr to replace Andy Dalton, but frankly I think you got really good play from Andy Dalton, so I'm really not sure if that's much of an upgrade. In the fourth round, they also draft Jake Haener, also from Fresno State, is also fairly Derek Carr-esque, probably just going to be a backup from them, but hey, maybe he could develop and become a starter. They also bring in Jamal Williams, and they draft Kendre Miller in the third round to help. Or they're replacing Mark Ingram, who frankly just was older, not a super productive player for them. And Jamal Williams is coming off a career year. He had 17 touchdowns last year. He was really, really excellent. They also draft A.T. Perry in the sixth round, kind of a late round guy that had some hype, a huge big body guy. They're losing Marquise Callaway and Jarvis Landry. Not huge losses for this offense. They also bring in Brian Edwards, who a couple years ago was a guy who had some hype but really hasn't done much with it. Bring in Foster Moreau, who is coming back from, I think it's Hodgkin's lymphoma. So really good for him. Good to see him back. He's a player that I really like. Replacing Adam Troutman, who also had not done much for the Saints last year. Bringing a couple interior offensive linemen in Nick Saldiveri and Billy Price. Be more depth than anything, but maybe could step in and play. And then you see a lot of change on this defensive line. Obviously, their first overall pick was Brian Brzee out of Clemson. You also bring in Nathan Shepard from the Jets and Kalen Saunders to help, fill up that interior line because they're losing Contavious Street, David Onyemata, and Shy Tuttle. Then they bring in Isaiah Foskey in the second round to help replace Marcus Davenport. They also threw a fifth-round pick at Jordan Howden. But in the back end, they lost Caden Ellis, Chris Harris, P.J. Williams, and Justin Evans. So if we're looking at this offseason as a whole, I'm really not sure how I'm feeling about this team. Obviously, this was a team that was 7-10 last year, and really I don't see a position in which they upgraded. Maybe running back, maybe tight end, and they're bringing some interior offensive line depth, but I'm really just not feeling super optimistic about this team based off what they did. Marcus Davenport, David Onyemata, Shy Tuttle were super underrated, productive players for this team. Caden Ellis was a linebacker that played pretty decent. And I really just think that this team is going to have some holes and some struggles. And then even as I was alluding at, Andy Dalton was actually really underrated and played really excellent for the Saints team. So overall, just temperature check, I'm just feeling, it's a little cold, a little lukewarm. I'm not sure if this offseason really is going to move the needle and make this a much better team. But let's go ahead and talk about the coaching staff. Another reason why I'm pretty low on this team, and that's going to start off with Dennis Allen. Was a phenomenal defensive coordinator for them. However, In his first year as a head coach, kind of just wasn't really feeling it. I do think his defense was still all right, but they took some steps back. Granted, the talent hasn't been as great as what it was, the last couple of seasons. And overall, outside of the new hires, he's probably on paper the worst head coach of anybody. So I'm just really not sure if this team is going to be able to overperform and be an excellent, well-coached unit under Dennis Allen. Obviously, it could still prove us wrong, and this defense could really, turn around and take some steps up. I'm just not really seeing it. I do think Sean Payton was doing a lot of heavy lifting for these Saints teams in the last couple of years. Granted, he did have some really good defenses, but we have seen a lot of defensive-minded guys not quite be able to translate their defense when they become the head coach. Dan Quinn is an example of it, who is interdivision. So there's just some hesitancies with him as the coach. However, he does have a fun little scheme. They have some big bodies on the offensive line. They're gonna have these physical man corners to really press up and play man coverage all across the field. I'm just not really sure if mainly the front seven is going to be able to really help this scheme play very well. And then they got Pete Carmichael as their offensive coordinator, was the right-hand man, Sean Payton, forever. Now that Sean Payton's gone, he's been doing a lot of the Sean Payton stuff. However, I do think Sean Payton was really good at getting players to overperform and kind of, cater the offense to the stuff that they were able to do and have these guys be super productive. And last year, the offense didn't really look amazing. They even had the one game where they got shut out, and like Andy Dalton was their leading rusher with like 20 yards. So I'm just not expecting this to be some amazing offense either. And then Joe Woods, most recently was in Cleveland. Out of any defensive coordinator, I don't know if anybody did less with more. He had a lot of talented players, and this Browns defense has been what's holding them back the last couple of years. So overall, this coaching is pretty suspect. Not really sure how we feel about Joe Woods. Obviously, he ran a lot of the split safety stuff that we've seen really take over the NFL. But he didn't really have the situational awareness to know when to change up what type of defense and, when to play man, when to play up tight. And, that Browns defense really struggled. So overall, I'm just not feeling that any unit of this team is going to be super well coached or a super dominant unit. So yet again, I'm worried about this team. Part of the reason I'm worried is, let's talk about this offense. So obviously, bring in Derek Carr from the Las Vegas Raiders. And last year was a really, really poor year from him. They bring in Josh McDaniels into the Raiders, and there was just a clash. He just didn't really fit the scheme. He seemed to lose confidence. He was erratic, wasn't playing very well, and just everything kind of went wrong for him. And obviously they ended up cutting him. They couldn't even trade him. They straight up just released him. And I'm just not sure what you're going to get from Derek Carr. I do think he's going to be better than he was last year, but I think it's going to be, be the 16th best quarterback, the 14th best quarterback. I don't think he's going to quite step up into that top 10 quarterback tier like he kind of did that year under John Gruden. That was so chaotic. And as I was saying, Andy Dalton was really, really good for this team last year. And I don't expect Derek Carr to come in and do anything better. I don't expect him to suddenly, carry this offense all around because, he wasn't doing that in Oakland, and he's not going to be much of an improvement to what Andy Dalton was doing, especially if we have, worries about some of the playmakers in this offensive line. Like, he's not going to be in a good situation, and he's going to struggle. And for some reason, people have expectations that he's going to come in and be amazing. I just don't see it. And I like Derek Carr. Don't get me wrong. I like Derek Carr. I just don't expect him to be a quarterback that's going to win a lot of games in a situation like this, especially if he's, dealing with confidence issues. So I'm just not really sure what version of Derek Carr we're going to get. But I doubt we're getting top 10 play. I think we're going to have kind of mid-tier regular play from Derek Carr with the potential to even struggle a lot. Behind him, Obviously, they got Jameis Winston who can come in and play, but he's the most erratic quarterback of all time, not named Ryan Fitzpatrick. Obviously, he had the 30 for 30 season, so he can come in and maybe you can just let him loose and let him just fire the ball around, but you also can't rely on Jameis Winston. They got Jake Haener, who you don't really want him seeing the field. He'll just kind of be a backup for them. And then I'll kind of mention Taysom Hill here. Not really quarterback, but obviously they like doing a lot of the Wildcat stuff and using him as quarterback every now and then. He's a cool little gadget player for them. Really good when he gets the ball in his hand, but, not full end tight end, not full quarterback, but can really, be productive and be a mismatched weapon for them. Part of my worries from this team, obviously, is I'm not sure what version of Derek Carr we're getting, but this wide receiver group is also really bad, and I think a lot of it's going to start with Michael Thomas, a guy who just hasn't been here. Obviously, he had the season where he broke the reception record with 149 catches, and since then, the last 3 seasons, he's played a total of 10 games, 7-ish games. He's played half a season in the last 3 years. I just, at what point do we expect, do we expect him to be on the field? I don't. He just hasn't been on the field at any point in the last 3 years, and I don't expect that to change. If he does come back and play, he'll probably be a productive wide receiver, but I would be stunned if we get 10 games, 16 games. That just doesn't seem like he wants to play football. I think he got his bag and would rather do anything else. He just hasn't been available, and I'm not going to expect him to suddenly be available. If he's out there and you have him and Chris Olave, you could have a, really productive passing game with 2 excellent wide receivers. But yet again, is he going to be out there? I don't know. And even if he is out there, I don't think it's going to be for most of the season. I think it'll be a portion of the season. But when he's out there, big body slot option, sure hands, and can get open quick. So, he's a good wide receiver when he plays. Yet again, will he play? Then they got Chris Olave. I think I had a really excellent rookie year. Someone who had on my fantasy team who I was glad I drafted late. And he's a really good wide receiver. Definitely don't think he's going to ever quite be a Jamar Chase, Justin Jefferson, because he's not some, insane ball winner. But I think he does have the potential to be kind of a low-end or kind of mid-tier wide receiver 1. I think he's a really good wide receiver. Has good speed to go deep, can win to most levels of the field. He's just not a huge contested catch guy. But I think he's really excellent, and I think he's going to end up being the wide receiver 1 for this team, just because obviously I don't think Michael Thomas is going to be there. But outside of him, gets a little sketchy. Rashid Shaheed started kind of breaking out last year. Obviously, he had the one game where he had a 50-yard touchdown and a punt return or something crazy. It would be fun to see how they get him more involved in the offense this year. Obviously, he's great with the ball in his hands and is really, really fast. So I think he could be a productive player for this team. We just didn't really see much last year. We saw these flashes, so we kind of just need to see him develop. But somebody that I'm excited and looking forward to. They got Brian Edwards, just kind of bounced around some teams last year. A couple years ago in Oakland, he seemed like a guy who was primed for a breakout and then just didn't do anything and then bounced around, and now he ends up here. So I'm not expecting anything from him. He has a lot of athleticism, so we could get something, but it hasn't happened yet, so I don't think it will at this point. I got Tre'Quan Smith, who is a guy who's been here forever now. It's just a solid wide receiver 4 to 5, but you don't really want him playing a whole lot, but there's a good chance that he's going to be your wide receiver 3 or even if you're wide receiver 2 throughout the season. So I'm just not expecting a whole lot from him. And then they got A.T. Perry, this big body wide receiver. Kind of gives them something that they don't have. But obviously a 6th-round rookie, not the greatest athlete. He's a good athlete, but not the greatest athlete, so I don't know how much he'll be involved in this passing game. They got James Washington, guy who was in, obviously, Pittsburgh for a while. Then went to Dallas, got injured, and then wasn't really used. So maybe he can find a way to become a decent playmaker because he was a really good wide receiver four on that Steelers team a couple years ago. So maybe he can develop into another solid wide receiver here. But I think outside Chris Olave, I'm not sure what we're expecting anybody else to do. Michael Thomas and Chris Olave are both playing. That's going to help Derek Carr in this offense a lot. But if it's just Chris Olave out there, I think he's going to end up, struggling a bit just because, he's going to be the main focal point and the only guy you have to worry, so he's going to get a lot of attention. But maybe we could see Rashid Shaheed step up for them to help this unit. But really, it's just, this is a bottom 10-ish unit just because I'm really not expecting Michael Thomas to be there. I got Jawan Johnson, who's not, not really one of the, he's more of the receiving tight end than he is like the traditional blocking tight end. And so he's honestly started taking a little bit of the Michael Thomas role of kind of the big body slot guy that these Sean Payton offenses like. And he'll be a solid receiving option for them, just not a great blocker. Then Foster Moreau is a guy who's buried in Oakland behind Darren Waller. And he's a guy that I've really liked. Not, some amazing, superb, athlete, but he's a really solid tight end, really solid athlete, really balanced, can kind of, an okay blocker, okay in the receiving game. Like, he's a solid guy. Obviously, he's coming back from Hodgkin's lymphoma, so really excited for him, and I think he'll be really good. And he'll probably be more of their traditional tight end, and Jawan Johnson will kind of flex out and almost be a lot more like a wide receiver more often. And then Jesse James kind of just the third blocking tight end. So yeah, I think, best case scenario, this wide receiver and tight end group can maybe stretch to be a top half unit. But with no Michael Thomas there, I think we're in line for a bottom, probably 16 to 24-ish ranked unit. I think Chris Olave is good enough to where he can kind of help them from being one of the bottom few. But with no Michael Thomas, it's really Chris Olave or bust for the most part. So I'm just not really sure how they're going to help support Derek Carr. The receiving game, Alvin Kamara has always been, a good receiving running back. But even he's not the same guy that he was 2017, 2018, back in the day. He's clearly fallen off and lost a step. Jamal Williams, not really much of a pass-catching running back. Benjamin was the guy in Arizona who kind of broke out and then instantly fell off a cliff. So maybe we could see some of that from him, but I'm not really expecting it. And then Kendra Miller, guy in the third round. I'm not sure if I see much receiving upside from him if Alvin Kamara is out there. So yeah, overall, just the weaponry, I'm just not super excited on how it's going to help the passing game, especially if we're going to get a poor version of Derek Carr. I think they're in for a really rough season. As I was talking about Alvin Kamara as a runner of the ball, I think he's just lost a step. I don't know if injuries have piled up or what, but he's not the same explosive guy that he once was. And obviously, there's maybe a suspension looming, so we don't know if he's going to miss part of the season, all of the season, if he's not going to miss anything. So who really knows, but I do think it's good that they brought in Jamal Williams, tough downhill runner, will lower his shoulder and, fight for tough yards, and obviously was really productive around the goal line last year. And so I think using him a lot more often, first and second downs to help keep Alvin Kamara fresh will help, Alvin Kamara's shelf life as well as help both these guys be a little bit more productive. So I think it's a really good signing. Jamal Williams is a guy I really like. So I think that's really going to help this running back room, help both of them, be the best versions of themselves. And then maybe Kendra Miller is able to kind of come in and be explosive. I imagine it'll probably take some time for him to kind of sneak into the rotation. But maybe he'll be able to do it if Alvin Kamara is suspended. But overall, skill positions, you have Alvin Kamara and Michael Thomas who are big names. But outside of that, there's not a whole lot of talent. I think this is an offensive unit that is struggling. And then you pair that with an offensive line that has some holes in it, we'll say. Some question marks. We'll start with Ryan Ramczyk, who is just a really solid right tackle. Not quite, one of the top 2 or 3 guys that he was at one point, but definitely top, 5-ish right tackle. Really good. Can run block and pass block pretty excellently. So you feel really good about him. Eric McCoy has been a center, kind of like the Ryan Kelly tier of just a good, not great center, and he's started a lot of games for this Saints team. So you feel good about what you're getting from those two, but everyone else has some question marks. Cesar Ruiz just hasn't fully developed. The guy that came out of Michigan that had some hype. So yet again, I'm not expecting him to take, huge strides this year. And then Andres Pete has been one of the most overrated players in the league for a while now. I think people have, caught up to it now, but at one point was making Pro Bowls despite not being a very good guard. So he's a little bit of a weakness. And then, behind him, you got Calvin Throckmorton, who's not really, much of a help either. They did bring in Nick Saldivari and Billy Price, who could theoretically rotate in and play in case of injury or start in case Andres Pete or Cesar Ruiz are struggling. But, yet again, they're not, great pieces either. I don't really think you want them starting. They can spot start as some depth, but I don't really know if we want a full 16 games, 17 games of Nick Saldivari as a rookie. And then we got Trevor Penning, who is a little bit of a question mark. Obviously, he missed most of last season, but got on the field late. And what we saw from him is a lot of what we expected. A guy who's going to be a really good run blocker. Obviously, he's like 6'7", 330 pounds, this huge, massive man. And so he's able to be a people mover and one of these huge maulers just because he's such a huge freak. He's got that asshole mentality, like he's just a little dickhead in the running game. So he was really good at that, but he struggled with some pass protection. Obviously, him coming out, that was something that people had some question marks about. And he showed part of why there was those concerns. But maybe you're hoping with another year he could kind of develop. It looked like sometimes he struggled with his hand placement. And obviously he's so large, he can get a little top heavy. So I do think that he will struggle and take some lumps as a pass protector. He was a really poor pass protector. And with Derek Carr, I don't know if you want your blindside guy to be a poor pass protector just because Derek Carr is not some guy with elite pocket presence. And so that could be a little recipe for disaster, especially as to step up to Cesar Ruiz and Andres Pete, who aren't going to necessarily be giving him a firm pocket to step into. So I think there is potential that he could struggle as a pass blocker and really be a liability for this offense and be a bit of a turnstile. But if he's able to develop and take some strides forward, then he'll end up, becoming a pretty decent tackle for them. And then they got James Hurst behind him, has been a solid kind of 6 swingman for this offensive line. Decent as a pass blocker, not quite as good of a run blocker. So I think there's definitely a world where Trevor Penning struggles in the passing game, and so they bring in James Hurst to kind of help shore up that back end. But overall, we look at this offense, I'm not really expecting much to change from last year. I think a lot of it's going to hinge on Michael Thomas and what he gives you. I think a lot of it's going to hinge on Derek Carr and what version of him that we get. And then a lot of it's going to hinge on Trevor Penning and if he's going to develop. I think those 3 players are going to be crucial for what this offense does become. We do have some guys that we feel good about, but I just don't see a world in which this is a top 10 unit. I think, best case, you're going to kind of hope for kind of a middle tier offense, but I think the potential for this to be kind of, the 24th to 16th offense in the league is a very plausible and very likely outcome for this team. So I think if you pair that with a defense that I'm pretty suspect of, I think that's part of the reason we're going to have a poor team this year. So let's go ahead and talk about this defense. And part of the reason that I'm really concerned is this front 7, mainly this defensive line. Cameron Jordan is the biggest name here, but at 34 years old, you can see he has started to slow down. He is still a pretty excellent run defender just because he's all of 290, 300 pounds. He's this huge dude, so he can really set the edge and be a good run defender. But he just hasn't been the same getting after the quarterback that he was in his prime. His pressure numbers have basically halved. Father Time is undefeated, and I think he's starting to slow down. I think he could really struggle as a pass rusher this year. But, first and second downs, he'll still be a really excellent run defender. But if he's your best player, I think that's going to lead to some troubles. And then they got Carl Granderson on the other edge, who is their Marcus Davenport 2.0. Athletically, build-wise, very similar, just doesn't quite have the power. But instead of paying Marcus Davenport, they decided they'll try to see what they can get from Carl Granderson and see if he could step up. I don't think he'll be quite as productive as Marcus Davenport. I don't think he has the tools to be quite as good of a player. But also, Marcus Davenport really struggled with injuries, so at least you'll probably get a full season of Carl Granderson. But even then, I don't, he'll be a decent run defender, but I don't expect him to get after the quarterback very much. And so if those two aren't getting after the quarterback, these guys behind them aren't really getting after either. Peyton Turner is a guy that's really struggled getting after the quarterback, but also a really big dude, so he'll be a decent run defender. Isaiah Foskey was a little bit of an overdraft too, and so maybe you'll hope that he can really break out as a rookie, but I'm not really expecting that from him. And I'm honestly not going to try to pronounce this guy's name, but also more of a run defender type. So really, I don't know who on the edge is getting after the quarterback. Maybe you hope Peyton Turner can break out and take those steps, but I don't really see it happening. And they obviously drafted a guy in the second round, so I don't know if they really see it happening either. So we're going to have a bit of a rotation, but who here is getting after the quarterback? I don't know, and I think that's going to be what's really going to cause this defense to struggle. The interior line, I think, Nathan Shepard and Kalen Saunders are good guys that can rotate in and out, but neither of them are, the greatest of pass rushers either. Kalen Saunders a little bit more of the run defending type. Nathan Shepard was able to get after the quarterback a little bit, but part of that was that 49ers scheme, and there was so much talent around him that really helped him. So I'm not really sure if we're going to get much from the interior. Malcolm Roach, also just straight up a nose tackle. So a lot of this D-line is going to hinge on what we get from Brian Brzee. To me, though, just watching his tape, he is a guy that looks a lot like Taven Bryan. Like, literally, they just look the same, similar builds, similar athleticisms. And Taven Bryan's been a guy that's been in the NFL and, played a lot of games since he was drafted in the first round. But it's been underwhelming just because he hasn't had the play strength to really hold up as an interior guy. And hasn't quite been as good as a pass rusher as people were expecting. And I think Brian Brzee is going to be very similar to that. Obviously, he's 300 pounds, like 6'5", so he's a huge dude. But to me, I'm just a little bit worried about some of his play strength. I don't think he's going to be, like Jerry Tillery liability where he's getting blown off the ball and can't hold up. But, I don't think he's going to be some dominant, run defender either. And then I think getting after the quarterback, he still has some weight. He's got short arms, so he's not really going to be a guy that's going to be able to rely on his power a whole lot with power rushes. And a lot of his production from Clemson came from stunts and stuff like that. So, I mean, he's an insane athlete, and so if they run a lot of stunts, I think he'll be able to do a lot of looping around and crashing down and be able to get after the quarterback that way. But, in more traditional pass rush sets, I'm not really expecting much from him. I do think he'll end up becoming a pretty decent pass rusher. I don't think he'll be, Aaron Donald or Chris Jones-esque, but I don't think he's going to be bad. But I think as a rookie, I'm not expecting a whole lot from him. Obviously, he had a really bad year, or not a bad year. His last year wasn't great at Clemson. He was a guy who was highly recruited coming out and really broke out as a freshman, but, tore his ACL, had a shoulder injury, had the COVID year, lost his little sister to cancer. So I think he's a great guy. I think he's a guy who's a fighter, who's going to work. I just have some concerns about his play strength and if he's going to be able to hack it in the NFL against NFL caliber athletes. Like, I can just see someone like Chris Lindstrom just absolutely blowing him off the ball in this division. So I just really don't know what we're getting from this front four on the D-line. If Brian Brzee breaks out and we get a little bit of the older version of Cameron Jordan, we could have a decent pass rush. I just, can't give him that much benefit of the doubt. So I'm just not expecting this defensive line to be a strength of this unit. They do have Demario Davis and Pete Werner as linebackers, though. Demario Davis is one of the handful of best linebackers in the league. Pete Werner is a guy who has, become a pretty good linebacker in his own right as well. Zach Bond's a little bit more of a rotational guy. So, I mean, they got a good linebacking unit. Demario Davis can get after the run and play, drop in coverage and, be very beneficial for this team. Pete Werner's learned a lot from Demario Davis and can do a little bit of both things as well. So they got a good linebacking unit, and that's going to help this defense, this D-line, especially in defending the run and in coverage, really. So, obviously you're happy about that, but they obviously don't have the same impact as, a D-line or some, corners and stuff like that do. So obviously you're glad you have them, but they're not, needle movers in the same way that like a Nick Bosa would be for this team, for example. Obviously Nick Bosa is a little bit different, but you know what I mean? So I think overall the front seven, the linebacking unit is really good, but the defensive line is not great. It's going to make this team struggle, I feel like. But they do have a pretty decent secondary that you're excited about. Marshawn Lattimore is probably the best guy here. Is one of the better corners in the NFL. Not quite, a Sauce Gardner or a Pat Surtain, but is still a really good corner in his own right. And plays really well in this scheme. He has the physicality and the speed to play man coverage and has been really productive here in New Orleans. You got Tyrann Mathieu, who's also been an excellent safety, for as long as he's been in the league. He is getting up there in age. So, maybe we could expect a little bit of regression due to age, but I still think he'll fly around. I think he'll come downhill, make some big hits. He'll fly around, make some splash plays in coverage. So, obviously, he's a good safety, and you're glad you have him. Marcus May is a guy who's struggled with some injuries, but when he plays is a pretty solid safety. Bradley Roby is one of the better slot corners in the league. So between, your slot corner, Marshawn Lattimore, and your safeties, you feel like you have a pretty good secondary. You just need Marcus May to, really stay healthy. You need Tyrann Mathieu to stay healthy because behind those, Marcus May and Tyrann Mathieu is not a whole lot of depth. And even behind Marshawn Lattimore, there's not a whole lot of depth either. If this defense is going to reach its full potential and be the unit that a lot of people think it can be, it's going to rely on this other cornerback spot between Alontae Taylor and Paulson Adebo to see if one of these guys could step up. Paulson Adebo is an athletic guy who has really splashed sometimes. It's also been a liability in coverage, but really does have the tools to where he could break out and be a really good corner for this team. And if he hits, like some people are expecting, this secondary might be one of the best in the NFL, like a top 5 unit for sure. We just do need to see, either Alontae Taylor or Paulson Adebo, one of these guys, really step up and make that spot their own. But the depth behind them is not great. You got Ugo Madi and Lonnie Johnson, who are okay in the slot. Isaac Yiadom, who's an okay corner as well. But overall, we need the starters to stay healthy just because the depth isn't great. But, if Paulson Adebo takes that step forward, then this is going to be a really good secondary. And it's going to help this defense and going to help this pass rush. Because if they're able to kind of hold guys and give these edge rushers more time to get after the quarterback, eventually they'll be able to do it. But inverse of that, this defensive line could be so poor, not get after the quarterback, that's going to make the secondary play worse than they are just because they're going to have to be covering for so long. So it could really go either of those routes. I do see a little bit of the second one happening where, they're going to have to be covering for so long that eventually they're going to start getting torched. But I think that if this defense is good and going to be a top 10 unit, it's going to be on the back of this secondary, not of this front seven. So overall, though, this defense does have some talent on the back half of it. I just do think that this defensive line is going to be a liability to this unit. But I think you're definitely, going to have also another kind of mid-tier-ish defense. I really don't see them hitting their ceiling of being a top 10 unit. And I really kind of think it's going to be, the 20th defense, the 18th defense. I think you're in store overall to where both sides of your team are going to be, you're going to be a balanced team. But I don't think you're going to have an offense that's winning you games. I don't think you're going to have a defense that's winning you games either. I think you're going to be just a pretty mid team on both sides of the ball. and without a true strength, I think that's going to hold this team back. However, they do have a beneficial schedule, and obviously they're playing in the NFC South, which is one of the weaker divisions in the NFL. Vegas has their line at 9.5, which I don't know. To me, just seems crazy. I don't necessarily. I mean, they do have an easy schedule, so I see why their line is high. But based off, last year this team was 7-10, and I don't think they got much better. For them to suddenly be a 10-win team seems absolutely insane to me. So obviously they open up at home against Tennessee, which I think they could win that game, but I could also see, Derrick Henry and the Titans running all over them. Then they have to go to Carolina, to Green Bay, which, I think they could win those games, but, it's obviously on the road, so not the easiest of games, and they have Tampa coming home. So definitely there's a world where they could start off their season 4-0, but I think you're probably going to be, 1-3, 2-2, 3-1. Like, I think they're going to lose at least one. I think 2-2 is probably pretty reasonable for them at this point in the schedule. They have to go to New England, to Houston. They have Jacksonville at home, at Indy, Chicago at home, and they have to go to Minnesota. So, I mean, they got a really, really good draw for the first half of their schedule. I think at New England is going to be a tough game, but outside of that, they have Chicago coming to home. They have to go to Houston, to Indy, which aren't great teams either. So, I think they can win a lot of these games. I think at New England, at Minnesota, and Jacksonville coming to home are probably going to be losses. But, I mean, there's a real world where this is a team that's 7-3 heading to their bye week. I think they'll probably be a little bit more. I think they'll end up losing a couple, so I think they'll probably be 5-5-ish heading to that bye week. But, there's a real possibility that this could be a 7-3 football team heading into the bye week. And so if they come off the bye at Atlanta, Detroit at home, Carolina at home, Giants at home, then they have to go to the Rams, to Tampa, and they end their season against the Falcons. I guess I could see why they could get 10 wins. I think it'd be a real fraudulent 10-win team. But, there are some games in there that they can really win. So overall, I do think they have a really easy schedule, but I do think probably week 18, 17, those two games are really going to be them competing to win this division and make the playoffs. But, they were a team that finished 7-10 last year. I think they're going to be a team that's going to be at 7, 8 or 9 wins. My projection has them at 8.7, so I'd pretty confidently take the under. Because, I don't think that they made enough improvements to really get a whole bunch of wins. But obviously they could benefit from a really easy schedule and be a playoff team. Overall, I'm lower on this team. I think they have a lot of holes that aren't being talked about, and I'm not expecting Derek Carr to really carry them. But obviously, as I was saying, I don't have a whole lot of trust in this coaching staff. I think Dennis Allen's a good defensive coordinator, but as a head coach, I don't know if he's really great. Then I'm not sure what we're expecting from Pete Carmichael or Joe Wood. So, we do have a little bit of worry about this coaching staff. Obviously, I've been hitting out this entire time. I really just don't think Derek Carr is going to come in and do anything that Andy Dalton wasn't doing. I don't think Derek Carr is coming in and suddenly are 3 wins better. I think he's going to be very similar to what Andy Dalton was last year. I mean, even if he's a little bit better, I think he's, a win better. I don't think he's going to suddenly make you the best team in the NFC. Obviously, the NFC is weaker, though, so, they could benefit off that. But obviously, are we expecting Kamara and Michael Thomas to play? And even if they do end up getting on the field, how much are we actually going to get from them? Alvin Kamara is a guy who will miss a couple games injury, and obviously Michael Thomas just hasn't been here. So how much will they play if they do play at all? And then pair that on defense with no pass rush, and a defense that I think will probably be good but not great. So I don't really think they have any true strengths to this team. But their weaknesses aren't, horrible. Like, their O-line's not great. Their wide receiver core isn't great outside of the top 2 guys. And even their D-line isn't great. But I don't think it's necessarily going to be the 31st or 32nd ranked unit in any of those. Maybe pass rush it will be, but I do think that they have enough talent on the back end of that defense to where it'll be a decent defense. I think they'll have a pretty high floor. Actually, no, I think they'll probably have a high ceiling. I think their floor might be lower just because I think teams will be able to gash them. But overall, it'll probably end up being an okay defense, but not one of the bottom 2 to 5 units in the league. But they do have an easy schedule. But do they have enough to get to 10 wins? I'm not fully sure. I just cannot imagine this Saints roster as a 10-win team. I do think 8-win season, 9-win season is probably in store for them. And I think that they're really going to be competing for winning the division at Tampa and at Atlanta in the last 2 games of the season. So overall, if you're a Saints fan, let me know. I imagine you're probably pretty optimistic about this season. Where do you think I'm wrong of my analysis of your team? But let me know where you kind of agree with me. Anyways, please subscribe. Thank you all very much for watching, and see you soon with another video. Thanks, guys.